The morning over Berlin began in brittle silence, the kind that settles over a city before the engines of war disturb the air. Frost clung to rooftops and airfields alike, turning every metal surface into a cold mirror of the pale March sky. Inside the Luftwaffe's radar stations, operators leaned over their scopes as the first clusters of signals emerged from the west. At a glance, it looked familiar. A vast procession of American aircraft pushing toward the capital. The pattern was so routine that a few men nodded to one another, already predicting how the next hours would unfold. In the command rooms, controllers interpreted the formation with the confidence born from repetition. They assumed the usual arrangement. The heavy bombers spread wide across altitude bands, the escorts trailing far behind. Forced to turn back long before Berlin. That rhythm had defined months of aerial combat. It had shaped tactics, losses, and expectations. There was a sense, quiet but present in every order issued, that they understood their enemy's limits. Out on the airfields, the German pilots moved with similar certainty. Boots struck the concrete as they sprinted toward their fighters, breath visible in the cold as engines roared awake. The men knew their role. They would climb high, break through the bomber boxes, and strike at the unprotected rear before the escorts could intervene. It was a pattern as familiar as the sound of the starter carts that echoed across the runways. But as the formations lifted into the gray sky, something shifted. Back in the radar rooms, the operators frowned at their screens. The escort signatures were behaving strangely. They were neither drifting behind nor thinning out at the usual distance. Instead, they were climbing and holding formation directly over the bombers. The anomaly was so stark that some believed it to be a miscalibration. Moments later, the truth became visible above the horizon. The first P-51 Mustangs appeared, not trailing the bombers but soaring above them, their silhouettes sharp and steady in the thin light. Then more emerged. High, fast, impossibly deep over Berlin. Only then did realization settle in. The Americans had crossed more than 1,600 miles to reach this sky. And the balance they had once accepted as fixed was about to change. Far more drastically than anyone below yet understood. From the frozen airfields outside Berlin, German ground crews tilted their heads upward, their eyes narrowing against the white glare of altitude. Thin contrails traced across the sky at more than 25,000 feet, curling like pale threads against the morning cold. At first, the men assumed they belonged to the bomber stream, the familiar tracks of the flying fortresses and liberators. But something was different. The lines moved too quickly, too sharply, crossing paths in a way that no heavy aircraft could manage. Then the shadows resolved into the unmistakable outlines of Mustangs, and a wave of disbelief rippled across the personnel below. No Allied fighter was supposed to be here, this deep, this high. For months, German intelligence had insisted on that certainty. Reports claimed that the Allies lacked the fuel capacity, the engine reliability, and the escort doctrine necessary for a fighter to reach Berlin and still fight. Analysts presented their assessments with calm authority. Commanders built their strategies around them. Even pilots, who often trusted experience more than paper, accepted the premise. The bombers would always arrive alone in their final approach. The escorts would always turn back somewhere over central Germany. It was a rule of survival. And of tactics. Now that rule was dissolving in real time. The P-51s moved through the bomber formation with an ease that made the scene unsettling. They flew not like a force struggling at the edge of its endurance, but like aircraft with fuel still to bargain. Their engines held a steady, confident pitch, weaving across altitude bands to inspect the German climb routes. The Mustangs were not guests in this airspace. They behaved as if they owned it. As German fighters lifted into the thinning air, the radio waves began to crackle with confusion. Interceptor pilots reported escorts where no escorts should be, altitude advantages where none were expected, and fuel states that defied every assumption headquarters had taught them. Voices overlapped with disbelief, each transmission chipping away at the old strategic foundation. Then the first engagement came. It was not German fighters diving on bombers. It was American Mustangs diving first, sweeping into the attack with the sun behind them, scattering the initial German wave before it could form. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe's long-trusted assumptions had collapsed. And above them, Unseen but already approaching, a deeper unraveling was preparing to begin. The Luftwaffe formations approached with the steady rhythm of experience, their lines tightening as they climbed toward 26,000 feet. For months, they had fought the same kind of battle, an ordered, high-altitude duel where timing and discipline determined survival. The pilots expected to see the familiar sight of bombers stretched in their box formations, slow and heavy, waiting for the first probing attack. Instead, as they closed the final miles, the sky revealed something that disrupted every expectation they carried into the air. The Mustangs were not scattered behind the bombers in a single, strained escort screen. They were layered. One group flew high above the formation, gliding like sentinels over the incoming German waves. Another wove among the bombers themselves, matching their pace as if guiding them through the cold March air. And a third, most unsettling of all, had surged ahead, already positioned between the bombers and the interceptors who believed they controlled the initiative. It was a geometry of air combat none of the Germans had witnessed before, and its implications became clear in seconds. The first fighters to fall were the ones who never fired a shot. Diving toward what they assumed was an exposed corridor, several Messerschmitts were intercepted before they reached their attack line. Their formations scattered as Mustangs dropped from above, cutting across their path with a precision that spoke of both training and confidence. Reports filled the radios, urgent, clipped, edged with rising alarm. Escorts were turning with them, climbing with them, even shadowing them during defensive spirals that should have shaken any pursuer loose. A threat they had once dismissed now matched them in every movement of the sky. The battle stretched across more than 40 miles of airspace, a long corridor of smoke trails, burning engines, and disintegrating assumptions. German pilots attempted regroupings, shifting altitudes, and coordinated attacks, but each effort collapsed under the pressure of an escort force that refused to tire and refused to break. What should have been a measured engagement became a sequence of brief, violent encounters, each ending the same way. By midday, 80 German aircraft had fallen, some to gunfire, some to failed evasions, some simply overwhelmed by a battle they had not been prepared to fight. A single day had overturned a doctrine built over years, forcing even the most seasoned commanders to confront an impossible question. How had the P-51 reached so far into the Reich, and what deeper change did that distance now promise? In the opening years of the war, the Luftwaffe moved through the skies of Europe with the assurance of a force that believed it understood the limits of flight. In 1940 and 1941, when the conflict's boundaries were still taking shape, German pilots spoke with a quiet certainty about their advantage in range, speed, and skill. Their aircraft seemed to confirm it. The Bf-109, lean and unforgiving, carried the reputation of a duelist's weapon, while the FW-190 arrived later as a more powerful successor, its broad wings and radial engine giving it a presence that unsettled opponents before a single shot was fired. In these years, German dominance felt less like a claim than an established fact. Across occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe's fighters climbed into clear skies with a consistency that shaped the thinking of an entire command structure. British aircraft struggled to match their climb rates. Soviet formations often lacked the training or coordination to contest altitude. Each victory, each interception, reinforced the belief that German engineering and training had placed the Reich at the forefront of aerial warfare. The assumption settled into doctrine. No other nation could match the Luftwaffe's mastery of the air, and no rival could extend its reach far enough to challenge Germany's industrial heartland. Central to this conviction was a simple, untested premise that fighters, no matter their origin, were bounded by the same limits of fuel and endurance. German strategists calculated effective ranges between 300 and 400 miles for all nations, give or take small variations. It was a number that appeared in reports, training manuals, and war games. From these figures, the Reich drew confidence. Berlin, Leipzig, and the factories that fed the Wehrmacht lay well beyond those assumed limits. Distance itself became a protective wall, requiring no reinforcement beyond faith in mathematics that had never been challenged. This belief gained further validation when the U.S. Army Air Forces entered the European theater in late 1942. The arrival of American heavy bombers, vast and numerous, did not shake the Luftwaffe's certainty. Instead, their early losses strengthened it. Each time the bomber streams crossed the German frontier, their escorts peeled away, compelled to turn back long before the intended targets. The moment the fighters disappeared, the Luftwaffe struck, carving into the bombers with practiced precision. Hundreds fell in those months, scattering wreckage across German fields and forests. To many in the Luftwaffe's leadership, these scenes were less a sign of battle than proof of the doctrine they had trusted. Reports circulated that America's high losses stemmed not from German strength alone, but from the inevitable limits of aviation itself. Commanders interpreted every ruined B-17 as confirmation that deep escort was impossible, that no fighter could travel far enough to protect a bomber force over the Reich. Confidence hardened into tradition. Tradition became dogma. And dogma, once settled, leaves little room for the possibility that another nation might rewrite the very limits on which it stands. A revision already underway far beyond Germany's sight. By early 1943, American commanders still spoke with confidence about the strength of their heavy bombers. The B-17 and B-24 had been designed as flying fortresses, machines built to endure hostile skies through armor, firepower, and formation discipline. Intelligence officers repeated the doctrine with steady assurance. A tight combat box could defend itself, even deep inside enemy territory. But these beliefs carried the quiet weight of theory, not yet tested against the concentrated force of the Luftwaffe. As the missions pushed farther into Europe, the gap between expectation and reality widened with every mile. The illusion broke on days like Schweinfurt and Regensburg. On August 17, 1943, the bombers pushed toward their industrial targets in southern Germany, climbing into clear skies that offered no cover and no mercy. Before the mission ended, 60 American aircraft were gone, hundreds of men dead, captured, or missing. The numbers stunned commanders, not because losses were unexpected, but because they were unsustainable. The Luftwaffe had struck with relentless precision, rising in waves from bases scattered across Germany, each unit waiting until the American escorts turned back. When the last P-47 pivoted toward England, the bomber crews knew the truth even before the enemy appeared. Air crews who survived spoke of those moments with a tone that carried more resignation than fear. They described the instant when the escorts vanished, a slow divergence of wings, a final banking turn, and how the horizon seemed to darken as the German fighters emerged to fill the void. Over Würzburg, Nuremberg, and the long corridors leading deeper into Bavaria, bomber gunners watched FW-190s make head-on passes with chilling confidence. The Germans attacked in disciplined, timed intervals, knowing no American fighter would intervene. Each run chipped away at a fortress that had been designed to fight back, but not alone. What troubled planners most was not the courage of their crews, but the arithmetic. For every 100 bombers dispatched, too many failed to return. Replacement aircraft could be built. Trained men could not. A mission meant to erode German industry was instead eroding the force meant to deliver it. Reports from the 8th Air Force headquarters grew colder in tone, stripped of earlier optimism. The numbers presented a clear verdict. Unescorted bombing into the Reich was a strategy that could not endure beyond a few more months. By the autumn of 1943, American leadership confronted what had once been unthinkable. Long-range escort was not a luxury or an advantageous addition. It was survival. Without a fighter capable of traveling the full distance to central Germany and back, the daylight bombing campaign would collapse under its own losses. The question shifted from whether such an aircraft existed to whether one could be created in time. And far from the battlefields where bombers struggled alone, engineers on both sides of the Atlantic were already shaping the machine that would decide the fate of those missions, though its true potential had not yet been understood. Long before the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, engineers on both sides of the war understood a fundamental constraint of flight. Range demanded fuel, and fuel demanded weight. The physics were simple, unforgiving, and universally accepted. Every additional gallon that extended a fighter's reach also dulled its agility, slowed its climb, and burdened its structure. In an era when survival depended on acceleration and turn rate, the idea of adding hundreds of pounds of fuel was viewed less as innovation and more as a slow surrender to gravity. This belief was not dogma born of pride. It was the arithmetic of aviation as it was understood in 1943. American designers had already tried to break those limits. The P-38J, with its twin engines and long wings, carried the promise of deep-range escort. But its complexity made it vulnerable in European weather, and its performance at high altitude deteriorated in ways no engineer had fully predicted. The P-47C, powerful and resilient, could cross vast stretches of sky with drop tanks, yet it lacked the fuel efficiency to reach Berlin and still fight with vigor upon arrival. Each attempt came close enough to raise hopes, but not close enough to alter the course of the air war. By mid-1943, almost had become a familiar verdict. Drop tanks offered a theoretical solution, but commanders approached them with caution. They were thin-skinned, easily punctured, and prone to ignite when struck. Many pilots viewed them as liabilities, extra targets hanging beneath their wings. Even when used successfully, drop tanks introduced a dilemma. A fighter burdened with external fuel was slower, heavier, and vulnerable during the first critical minutes of engagement. The trade-off seemed clear. To survive in combat, the tanks needed to be jettisoned early. But to reach deep into Germany, they needed to stay attached far longer. The conflict between endurance and survival appeared impossible to resolve. Within the U.S. Army Air Forces, the debate took on sharper tones. Some argued for heavier fighters with massive internal tanks, but critics warned that such machines would only become slower targets, aircraft that reached Berlin not as escorts, but as burdens to the bombers they intended to protect. Others pressed for more powerful engines, unaware that raw horsepower meant greater fuel burn, and greater fuel burn meant the same old limitation returning through a different door. The deeper the planners explored the problem, the more circular their reasoning became. German strategists watched these developments with analytical confidence. Their assessments concluded that no nation, neither Britain nor the United States, could construct a fighter that combined bomber-level range with interceptor-level agility. The Luftwaffe's defensive grid, built across hundreds of miles of Europe, relied on this assumption. Radar sites, fighter bases, and flak batteries were arranged around the belief that an escort fighter would always fall away before reaching critical targets. It was a limitation they trusted as firmly as steel. What no one yet understood was that the solution would not come from adding more fuel or more power alone. It would emerge from a rethinking of the very assumptions that defined fighter design, an overturning not of engineering alone, but of doctrine itself. The aircraft that would one day redefine the air war over Europe did not begin as an American ambition. It began as a British request, made at a moment when Britain faced a dwindling supply of fighters and needed an additional production line beyond its own capacity. Representatives from the Royal Air Force approached North American aviation with a simple proposal: build P-40s under license. But North American countered with an offer that carried both confidence and risk. Rather than produce an older design, they promised to construct a completely new airframe, faster, cleaner, and more modern, within 120 days. In wartime aviation, where design cycles typically stretched over years, such a claim bordered on audacity. Against expectation, the engineers delivered. They designed a sleek, low-drag fuselage and paired it with a laminar flow wing that reduced turbulence and preserved energy at speeds few fighters of the era could sustain. When the prototype lifted into the air in October 1940, its performance stunned observers. It climbed smoothly, accelerated efficiently, and turned with a fluidity that revealed the promise hidden in its design. Yet the promise was not yet complete. The early Mustang was powered by the Allison V1710 engine, an engine that excelled at low altitudes but withered in the thin air above 15,000 feet. In a war increasingly fought at 20,000 and beyond, this limitation proved decisive. As a result, the first Mustangs found themselves assigned to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack roles. They skimmed over fields and rail lines in France, striking targets that demanded speed rather than altitude. Pilots praised the aircraft's handling, its visibility, and its stability during long, fast runs. But in a theater defined by the need to escort bombers to high-altitude objectives, the Mustang remained a peripheral tool, admired but not central. It was a fighter without a mission, respected for its innovations yet unable to join the decisive battles above the clouds. Still, engineers on both sides of the Atlantic saw something unusual in the airframe. The laminar flow wing, with its theoretically ideal distribution of airflow, allowed the Mustang to conserve fuel at a rate no contemporary fighter could match. Its internal arrangement permitted greater fuel storage without dramatically compromising agility. RAF analysts, reviewing mission logs, noticed another detail. The Mustang consumed significantly less fuel per mile than the Spitfire. What was a curiosity to some became a revelation to others. While the United States viewed the Mustang as a limited low-altitude aircraft, the British began to see the outline of something more ambitious. Through late 1942, scattered voices inside the RAF and among engine designers floated a single, persistent idea. If the Mustang's Achilles heel was its Allison engine, then perhaps the solution was not to modify the airframe but to replace the heart within it. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, already powering the Spitfire and Lancaster, offered strong performance at altitude, smooth operation, and a supercharger capable of holding power where the Allison faded. Pairing the Mustang's aerodynamic efficiency with the Merlin's altitude capability promised an aircraft that might rewrite the assumptions about what a fighter could achieve. The proposal moved quietly at first. Engineers at Rolls-Royce conducted the initial conversions in small workshops, fitting Merlins into Mustang fuselages with makeshift mounts and improvised connections. Test flights began with little fanfare, yet the results were immediate and unmistakable. The aircraft climbed faster, held power at altitude, and retained every advantage of the original design. What had been a low-level specialist now leapt into a new category altogether, one where range, speed, and high-altitude performance converged in a manner that no contemporary aircraft had achieved. By the time American observers witnessed the modified Mustang, the truth was already clear to those who had flown it. This was no longer an aircraft without a mission. This was a fighter that could challenge the very limitations engineers had long accepted as immutable. The question was no longer whether it could reach deeper into Europe than any escort before it. The question was how soon it could be built in numbers large enough to change the course of the air war entirely. In the final months of 1942, inside a quiet workshop at Rolls-Royce, a small group of engineers began an experiment that would alter the direction of the air war. They rolled a Merlin 61 engine, sleek, compact, and already proven at altitude, beside a Mustang airframe that seemed almost waiting for it. The first test fit was cautious, tubes and mounts adjusted by hand. But as the two machines came together, the room held a sense of restrained anticipation. For years, engineers had searched for a way to combine aerodynamic purity with high-altitude strength. Now, in this unassuming space, that combination began to take physical form. The first flight of the Merlin-powered Mustang erased any doubts. As the aircraft rose above the clouds, its climb rate surged past expectations, lifting with a confidence the Allison engine had never possessed. Pilots reported a new sharpness in response, a willingness to accelerate that made the airframe feel lighter than its weight suggested. At full throttle, the modified Mustang pushed beyond 400 miles per hour, numbers that placed it among the fastest operational fighters of the war. More revealing was its behavior at altitude. Where the Allison had gasped, the Merlin breathed easily, holding power past 25,000 feet and transforming the aircraft into a machine suited for the very battles the Allies needed to win. When American observers stationed in Britain witnessed the early tests, they understood immediately what they were seeing. The long-standing search for a deep-range escort had been hindered by compromises: heavier airframes, unstable fuel loads, engines that fell short in the thin air. Here, before them, was something different. The Mustang did not require compromise. It offered speed without sacrificing range, altitude without losing agility. Reports crossed the Atlantic with unusual urgency. What had begun as a British experiment quickly became a priority for the U.S. Army Air Forces. Scaling the breakthrough required more than enthusiasm. It required production, and production at American wartime levels meant standardization. The Merlin engine, originally British, was licensed to Packard in Detroit. There, engineers adapted the design to American manufacturing practices, preserving its performance while enabling mass output. The Packard-built Merlins emerged with the precision needed for high-altitude combat, and soon factory lines were feeding the engines directly into North America's growing assembly network. The Mustang was no longer an experimental hybrid. It was becoming a fleet. Test flights grew more ambitious as winter turned into early 1943. Pilots pushed the aircraft through steep climbs and sudden dives, measuring its reactions against the German fighters dominating European skies. Against the Bf-109, the Mustang demonstrated a decisive climb advantage. Against the FW-190, it showed a tighter turn radius at the altitudes that mattered most. Where other escort fighters had been forced to choose between range and maneuverability, the Merlin Mustang offered both, an unsettling development for Luftwaffe analysts once they learned of it. Yet the most surprising advantage was not speed or agility. It was fuel. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, nearly dismissed in the Allison era, revealed its full potential when paired with the Merlin. The aircraft burned fuel at a remarkably low rate for its performance class, allowing it to travel farther on less. A quality almost invisible in specifications but decisive in operational planning. Commanders who calculated escort limits by the mile found themselves confronting new numbers that defied the formulas they had trusted. A fighter with this efficiency could cross the Channel, strike deep into Germany, and still return with fuel to fight. As engineers evaluated the data, a realization settled in that felt almost unsettling. They had created a fighter that broke the rules they themselves had written. Range no longer required sacrifice. Speed no longer demanded vulnerability. The limits that had shaped doctrine for years now seemed temporary, artifacts of an earlier stage of aviation. And as the black and white test footage played in briefing rooms from London to Washington, one conclusion became unavoidable. The long-range escort the Allies had searched for, argued over, and nearly abandoned was no longer theoretical. It was ready, just in time for a war that was about to reach deeper skies than ever before. As 1943 turned into 1944, the 8th Air Force confronted a requirement so vast it seemed almost unrealistic. To break German industry, American bombers needed to reach Berlin in daylight, strike their targets, and return home. But the mathematics of survival demanded something more. Fighters had to accompany them for the entire 1,650-mile journey. No aircraft in the Allied arsenal had ever done it. The skies beyond central Germany were places where escorts vanished, where bombers faced the Luftwaffe alone. To change the war, the Allies had to reverse that pattern. They needed a fighter that could fly to Berlin, defend itself, defend others, and still have the fuel to fight its way home.
The challenge pushed engineers back to a solution many had once dismissed as too fragile to trust: external drop tanks. Early versions were thin, vulnerable, and prone to ignite under fire. They were considered stopgaps, not tools of strategy. But the need for distance forced a reinvention. Designers replaced fragile sheet metal tanks with stronger steel versions and, more surprisingly, with paper-based composite tanks sealed with resin. These seemingly simple materials absorbed bullets without shattering and weighed far less than their metal predecessors. What had once been a liability began to take on the shape of an asset. Two sizes became central to the Mustang's future: the 75-gallon steel tank and the 108-gallon composite tank. Attached beneath the wings, they allowed the P-51 to stretch its range far beyond anything earlier escorts could achieve. With both tanks full, pilots could cross the North Sea, escort the bomber stream deep into Saxony or Brandenburg, and still retain enough internal fuel to fight above the target. The drop tanks were jettisoned only when the Germans appeared, releasing the fighter from its burden and transforming it back into a machine of agility and speed. Yet even with these tanks, endurance was not guaranteed. The Mustang's extended range depended on a kind of discipline that went beyond flying skill. Pilots learned to manage their fuel the way a diver manages breath, each adjustment measured, each movement deliberate. At cruising altitude, they set mixture levers with the precision of a surgeon, leaning the fuel flow until the engine ran at its most efficient boundary. They practiced climbing at shallow, fuel-saving angles instead of dramatic ascents. And they learned to hold formation without sudden throttle bursts, avoiding the tiny, cumulative losses that could shorten a mission by miles. Behind these changes, engineers in the United States and Britain refined the Mustang's architecture. They strengthened the hardpoints beneath the wings to carry the heavier 108-gallon tank safely. They modified the fuel plumbing to allow smoother transfer from external tanks to internal reserves. They made subtle aerodynamic adjustments, small fairings, reinforced fittings, and drag-smoothing panels that preserved efficiency across long distances. Each improvement seemed minor on its own, but together they formed a network of refinements that shaped the Mustang into a machine built not just for speed, but for endurance. Simulations began as cautious explorations and soon became confident predictions. Test pilots flew long-range profiles across the British Isles, tracing the arcs and altitudes that combat missions would one day require. Fuel records were logged, recalculated, and verified. In those controlled flights, the Mustang reached the theoretical numbers, distances once considered unattainable. But war is not a simulation, and commanders knew the calculations meant little until they were tested over Germany, against cold winds, flak bursts, and an enemy determined to exploit every weakness. The final preparations unfolded quietly. New tanks were fitted. Pilots reviewed their fuel sequences again and again. Ground crews inspected seals and connections, knowing a single leak could ruin a mission. Each element pointed toward an objective that had once been beyond imagination. Fighter protection not just near the coast, not just over the Ruhr, but all the way to Berlin itself. As the Mustang pilots stood beside their aircraft on those cold English mornings, they understood what their machines were now being asked to do. The Luftwaffe believed the range was impossible, that no fighter could escort a bombing force into the heart of the Ruhr and still return home in strength. It was a belief etched into German planning, reinforced by years of experience. And now the P-51 was preparing to attempt exactly that, a flight that would test not only engineering, but the very limits of a doctrine Germany still trusted. On the morning of January 11, 1944, the 354th Fighter Group lifted off from English airfields under low winter light, their engines sending long echoes across the frost-covered countryside. The mission was unlike any they had attempted before. Their task was to escort the bombers bound for Stursleben and Halberstadt, industrial targets deep inside Germany, far beyond the range any American fighter had previously reached in strength. For the men in those cockpits, the significance was unmistakable. This was a test not simply of the Mustang, but of a new doctrine built on fuel management, discipline, and the belief that the era of unprotected bombers was ending. As the formation crossed the North Sea and the German coastline appeared below, everything felt familiar to the Luftwaffe listening on radio frequencies. The sequence of radar contacts and the measured advance of the bomber stream matched months of routine. German squadrons climbed in anticipation of another predictable battle. Fighters turning back at the border, bombers arriving alone, and a sky cleared by tactics they had mastered. But as the German pilots climbed toward their interception altitudes, they found something waiting for them that altered the day instantly. For the first time in the war, fighters appeared where fighters should not be, over central Germany, hundreds of miles beyond the normal limits of American escort range. Surviving German pilots later described their disbelief as Mustangs materialized above them, descending with the urgency and precision of hunters who had arrived early. In debriefings, some Luftwaffe officers insisted they must have misjudged the silhouettes. Others claimed they had been decoyed by new aircraft. But the truth was plain on the gun camera film. The Mustangs were not only present, they held the altitude advantage. The first engagements unfolded with a quiet ruthlessness. German formations rising to meet the bombers suddenly found themselves under attack from above, a reversal of the vertical geometry that had favored them for years. The Mustangs dove through the Luftwaffe's climb routes, their speed amplified by altitude and cold air, scattering interceptors before they could form cohesive strikes. Pilots accustomed to dictating the first move now found themselves reacting, forced into defensive turns that cost energy and time. Each moment spent recovering was a moment the bombers continued unmolested toward their targets. Inside 8th Air Force headquarters, the reports arriving from the mission carried a tone unlike earlier operations. For the first time in months, bomber crews radioed gratitude instead of distress. Losses still occurred, but they were measured, not catastrophic. The gap between the escort's withdrawal and the enemy's attack, the deadly window that had claimed so many American aircraft, had closed. Commanders, reading the preliminary summaries, understood immediately what this meant. The daylight bombing campaign, long balanced on the edge of viability, had gained the protection it had always needed. Over Stursleben and Halberstadt, the Luftwaffe fought with determination, launching wave after wave from bases scattered across central Germany. But each wave arrived diminished. The Mustangs harassed climbing fighters, intercepted assembly groups, and refused to yield altitude advantages. By the end of the engagement, German losses were significantly higher than the American totals, an inversion that had once seemed impossible. The pattern repeated itself in intelligence summaries: American loss rates falling, German loss rates rising. It was the beginning of a shift not merely tactical, but strategic. In Berlin, Luftwaffe Command reviewed the day's outcomes with a mixture of confusion and irritation. Their analysts could not reconcile the distances involved with the presence of escort fighters. The operational maps made no sense. The only explanation they considered plausible was that the Americans must have constructed temporary forward airfields or were staging the Mustangs from unknown bases closer to the Rhine. The assumption fit their expectations, fit their doctrine, fit the world as they understood it. But it was wrong. The Mustangs had come from England, directly, without hidden staging fields, without secret bases, carrying with them not only fuel, but a range that Germany still believed to be impossible. And deep inside the Luftwaffe's command corridors, a far more unsettling question was beginning to form, one that would echo through the months ahead. If the Americans could reach this far today, how much farther could they reach tomorrow? In February 1944, the air war over Europe entered a new phase, one defined not by isolated raids or tentative advances, but by a sustained offensive designed to break the Luftwaffe at its core. Operation Argument, later remembered simply as Big Week, aimed to dismantle Germany's aircraft industry through a series of relentless strikes. The targets were factories, assembly plants, and component work stretching from Gotha to Regensburg. But the true objective lay beyond the buildings themselves. The Allies intended to force the Luftwaffe into the air again and again, until its strength, its aircraft, its pilots, its doctrine, began to fracture under pressure. As the bombers advanced toward their targets, the P-51 squadrons moved with them in sweeping arcs, their patterns fluid yet disciplined. For the German pilots rising to meet the threat, the encounters felt different from the start. In previous years, they had dictated the timing of attacks, climbing to their preferred altitudes and striking from positions of advantage. Now, the Mustangs disrupted those familiar rhythms. They appeared above the bomber stream before the Germans could assemble. They intercepted climbing formations at altitudes once considered safe. They hovered at the edge of every maneuver, denying the Luftwaffe the time and space needed to choose its moment. German pilots who survived the first days of Big Week spoke of an unsettling consistency. The Mustangs fought with the confidence of machines operating well within their limits. Even after long-running engagements stretching across dozens of miles, the American fighters did not seem to tire. They did not begin desperate climbs. They did not break off for lack of fuel. Instead, they pressed forward, fresh, unwavering, and present in numbers the Luftwaffe had not expected. The assumption that Allied escorts would always fade with distance no longer held. The Mustangs appeared able to stay for as long as the battle demanded. Within the American formations, the new escort tactics evolved with remarkable speed. Instead of flying rigidly with the bombers, P-51 groups adopted weaving patrols that covered the bomber stream from multiple angles. Some squadrons held altitude above the formation, ready to dive on attackers. Others swept outward from the edges, intercepting German units before they could form strike groups. The goal was no longer defensive survival, it was active denial. Every Luftwaffe attempt to organize a coordinated attack met a Mustang squadron already in motion, turning each German climb into a contest that drained energy and time. As the battles raged day after day, the cost to the Luftwaffe grew heavier than the loss of metal alone could measure. Veteran pilots, men who had survived years of combat from the Channel to the Eastern Front, fell in increasing numbers. These were aviators who understood the nuances of air combat, who carried the experience needed to train younger flyers, who had once formed the backbone of Germany's aerial defense. Their absence began to hollow out the Luftwaffe from within. Replacement pilots arrived, but they lacked the hours, the confidence, and the instinctive judgment required to face seasoned Mustang squadrons. In the chaotic skies of Big Week, inexperience became a quiet doom. Meanwhile, the factories the Germans relied upon struggled under mounting pressure. Precision plants at Schweinfurt, Messerschmitt works at Regensburg, assembly shops in Brunswick and Gotha, all suffered disruptions that rippled through the supply chain. Spare parts arrived late or not at all. New fighters emerged from production lines slower than losses could be replaced. Even when aircraft rolled off the floor, they often waited days for engines, tires, or instruments that factories could no longer deliver on time. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train them and aircraft faster than it could build them, a dual erosion that no defensive doctrine had been designed to withstand. By the end of Big Week, the German command understood that a crisis was forming at a pace they had not predicted. The Mustangs had become more than escorts. They had become hunters, sweeping the skies with purpose and precision. German planning could no longer rely on fuel exhaustion or predictable withdrawal. The old air war was slipping away, replaced by a new kind of contest, the kind fought on terms the Allies now controlled. The first engagements unfolded with a quiet ruthlessness. German formations rising to meet the bombers suddenly found themselves under attack from above, a reversal of the vertical geometry that had favored them for years. The Mustangs dove through the Luftwaffe's climb routes, their speed amplified by altitude and cold air, scattering interceptors before they could form cohesive strikes. Pilots accustomed to dictating the first move now found themselves reacting, forced into defensive turns that cost energy and time. Each moment spent recovering was a moment the bombers continued unmolested toward their targets. Inside 8th Air Force headquarters, the reports arriving from the mission carried a tone unlike earlier operations. For the first time in months, bomber crews radioed gratitude instead of distress. Losses still occurred, but they were measured, not catastrophic. The gap between the escort's withdrawal and the enemy's attack, the deadly window that had claimed so many American aircraft, had closed. Commanders, reading the preliminary summaries, understood immediately what this meant. The daylight bombing campaign, long balanced on the edge of viability, had gained the protection it had always needed. Over Östersleben and Halberstadt, the Luftwaffe fought with determination, launching wave after wave from bases scattered across central Germany. But each wave arrived diminished. The Mustangs harassed climbing fighters, intercepted assembly groups, and refused to yield altitude advantages. By the end of the engagement, German losses were significantly higher than the American totals, an inversion that had once seemed impossible. The pattern repeated itself in intelligence summaries: American loss rates falling, German loss rates rising. It was the beginning of a shift not merely tactical, but strategic. In Berlin, Luftwaffe Command reviewed the day's outcomes with a mixture of confusion and irritation. Their analysts could not reconcile the distances involved with the presence of escort fighters. The operational maps made no sense. The only explanation they considered plausible was that the Americans must have constructed temporary forward airfields or were staging the Mustangs from unknown bases closer to the Ruhr. The assumption fit their expectations, fit their doctrine, fit the world as they understood it. But it was wrong. The Mustangs had come from England, directly, without hidden staging fields, without secret bases, carrying with them not only fuel, but a range that Germany still believed to be impossible. And deep inside the Luftwaffe's command corridors, a far more unsettling question was beginning to form, one that would echo through the months ahead. If the Americans could reach this far today, how much farther could they reach tomorrow? In February 1944, the air war over Europe entered a new phase, one defined not by isolated raids or tentative advances, but by a sustained offensive designed to break the Luftwaffe at its core. Operation Argument, later remembered simply as Big Week, aimed to dismantle Germany's aircraft industry through a series of relentless strikes. The targets were factories, assembly plants, and component work stretching from Gotha to Regensburg. But the true objective lay beyond the buildings themselves. The Allies intended to force the Luftwaffe into the air again and again, until its strength, its aircraft, its pilots, its doctrine, began to fracture under pressure. As the bombers advanced toward their targets, the P-51 squadrons moved with them in sweeping arcs, their patterns fluid yet disciplined. For the German pilots rising to meet the threat, the encounters felt different from the start. In previous years, they had dictated the timing of attacks, climbing to their preferred altitudes and striking from positions of advantage. Now, the Mustangs disrupted those familiar rhythms. They appeared above the bomber stream before the Germans could assemble. They intercepted climbing formations at altitudes once considered safe. They hovered at the edge of every maneuver, denying the Luftwaffe the time and space needed to choose its moment. German pilots who survived the first days of Big Week spoke of an unsettling consistency. The Mustangs fought with the confidence of machines operating well within their limits. Even after long-running engagements stretching across dozens of miles, the American fighters did not seem to tire. They did not begin desperate climbs. They did not break off for lack of fuel. Instead, they pressed forward, fresh, unwavering, and present in numbers the Luftwaffe had not expected. The assumption that Allied escorts would always fade with distance no longer held. The Mustangs appeared able to stay for as long as the battle demanded. Within the American formations, the new escort tactics evolved with remarkable speed. Instead of flying rigidly with the bombers, P-51 groups adopted weaving patrols that covered the bomber stream from multiple angles. Some squadrons held altitude above the formation, ready to dive on attackers. Others swept outward from the edges, intercepting German units before they could form strike groups. The goal was no longer defensive survival, it was active denial. Every Luftwaffe attempt to organize a coordinated attack met a Mustang squadron already in motion, turning each German climb into a contest that drained energy and time. As the battles raged day after day, the cost to the Luftwaffe grew heavier than the loss of metal alone could measure. Veteran pilots, men who had survived years of combat from the Channel to the Eastern Front, fell in increasing numbers. These were aviators who understood the nuances of air combat, who carried the experience needed to train younger flyers, who had once formed the backbone of Germany's aerial defense. Their absence began to hollow out the Luftwaffe from within. Replacement pilots arrived, but they lacked the hours, the confidence, and the instinctive judgment required to face seasoned Mustang squadrons. In the chaotic skies of Big Week, inexperience became a quiet doom. Meanwhile, the factories the Germans relied upon struggled under mounting pressure. Precision plants at Schweinfurt, Messerschmitt works at Regensburg, assembly shops in Brunswick and Gotha, all suffered disruptions that rippled through the supply chain. Spare parts arrived late or not at all. New fighters emerged from production lines slower than losses could be replaced. Even when aircraft rolled off the floor, they often waited days for engines, tires, or instruments that factories could no longer deliver on time. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train them and aircraft faster than it could build them, a dual erosion that no defensive doctrine had been designed to withstand. By the end of Big Week, the German command understood that a crisis was forming at a pace they had not predicted. The Mustangs had become more than escorts. They had become hunters, sweeping the skies with purpose and precision. German planning could no longer rely on fuel exhaustion or predictable withdrawal. The old air war was slipping away, replaced by a new kind of contest, the kind fought on terms the Allies now controlled. But the decisive blow had not yet fallen. It waited in the coming weeks, on missions that would push even deeper into the Ruhr, where the consequences of this shifting balance would reveal themselves fully for the first time. On March 6, 1944, a cold wind moved across the fields of northern Germany, carrying with it the low, distant vibration of engines. To the men watching radar screens inside Luftwaffe command posts, the formation appeared larger than usual, hundreds of aircraft pushing eastward, forming a great arc across the morning sky. Their target soon became clear: Berlin. A daylight strike on the capital had long been predicted, even expected, yet the confidence within German command remained unshaken. They believed the bombers would arrive alone. Escort fighters would fall away somewhere over Saxony, just as they had always done. And once the American formation was stripped of its shield, the Luftwaffe would deliver the devastating blows they had practiced for years. But as the bombers pressed forward, the Germans noticed a deviation from the familiar pattern. The expected thinning of escort signatures did not appear on their radar. Instead, the traces held firm, tight, fast, and climbing. When the first German fighters rose to meet the bomber stream, they looked upward to measure the distance before making their approach. What they saw forced an abrupt recalculation. The Mustangs were still there. Some hovered above the bomber formation, silhouettes cutting clean lines across the thin light. Others drifted ahead, scouting the airspace as if mapping the routes the Germans might use. They had not turned back over central Germany. They had followed the bombers all the way to Berlin. The realization unsettled even the most experienced German pilots. For years, they had climbed into battles with a familiar sense of timing. Strike early, withdraw, refuel, strike again. But now, as they gathered altitude, they found the Mustangs already descending upon them. The Americans attacked not as a scattered screen but as coordinated layers. One flight disrupted the German climb pattern. Another intercepted the first wave before it could assemble. A third moved laterally, blocking escape routes and forcing defensive turns before the Luftwaffe could form its traditional attack groups. What followed was a battle marked by chaos rather than choreography. FW-190s rolled into steep spirals, trying to shake pursuers who matched their movements with unsettling precision. Bf-109s, climbing to reach the bomber's altitude, found themselves ambushed mid-ascent, caught at the moment when engine strain hardest and speed was least. Gun camera footage from the day shows German fighters breaking apart under bursts of .50 caliber fire, spinning downward in long, smoke-trailed arcs. The math of the engagement became brutally one-sided. German pilots, once confident in altitude advantage and fuel timing, now found themselves reacting to an enemy that dictated the terms of every encounter. High above the city, the bomber crews witnessed a scene they had not seen in months. Escorts engaging relentlessly, from the first German interception to the final withdrawal. For the first time, the bomber stream did not face a long, unprotected stretch. The Mustangs remained, above, ahead, and alongside, through every phase of the mission. American losses, while present, were no longer catastrophic. German losses, by contrast, mounted with alarming speed. By afternoon, the scale of the shift became undeniable. 80 German fighters were destroyed in the span of a single day, veterans and new pilots alike. It was not the number alone that shook the Luftwaffe command, but the implications behind it. Their entire strategy for defending the Reich rested on the assumption that escorts could not reach Berlin. That assumption had allowed them to plan interception corridors, fuel reserves, and pilot rotations with confidence. Now, in a single raid, that doctrine had been rendered obsolete. The air defense network Germany had spent years refining, its radar stations, its fighter bases, its staggered altitude tactics, could not easily adapt to an enemy that no longer played by the old limits. The loss of aircraft was damaging. The loss of experienced pilots was devastating. Even more troubling was the loss of certainty, the collapse of a belief that had shaped every German decision since 1940. And as smoke drifted over Berlin and scattered debris fell into fields far below, one truth settled across both sides of the air war: the myth of German air superiority had died that day. But the consequences of its death were only beginning to unfold, stretching toward operations still gathering force beyond the horizon. In the aftermath of the Berlin raid, the Luftwaffe confronted a reality it had long believed impossible. The High Command reviewed its rosters and found the numbers slipping in the one place Germany could least afford: experienced pilots. Losses that once seemed manageable now outpaced training by a margin no air force could sustain. The pilots who had carried years of combat experience, from the Battle of Britain to the Eastern Front, were gone in increasing numbers, replaced by men who had never faced the pressure of a high-altitude interception or the speed of a Mustang diving from above. What had been a steady erosion became a widening fracture, one that no amount of replacement aircraft could mend. Compounding this loss was a growing scarcity of fuel, a consequence of Allied bombing and dwindling reserves of synthetic production. Aviation gasoline became a rationed commodity. New pilots, already short on experience, now flew with strict limits on their training hours. Some arrived at operational units having practiced only basic maneuvers. Others had never fired their guns in a live exercise. In briefing rooms, instructors found themselves explaining tactics to men who lacked the hours to execute them. The Luftwaffe once prided itself on rigorous preparation. Now it fielded pilots who entered combat almost as students rather than soldiers. Across the Reich, entire Gruppen operated at half strength. Aircraft stood ready on airfields, but pilots capable of flying them grew fewer each month. The mismatch created an illusion that Germany still possessed a formidable air arm, rows of fighters, expertly maintained, aligned in disciplined formations on the ground. But those machines meant little without the men able to harness their potential. When fresh pilots climbed into them, their inexperience showed in the opening minutes of battle. They lost energy in turns, mistimed dives, and hesitated when decision had to be instantaneous. Advanced aircraft became unforgiving classrooms, and the sky above Germany turned into a place where training deficiencies carried fatal consequences. As Germany weakened, the Americans advanced with a new kind of confidence. P-51 squadrons no longer saw themselves merely as escorts. They became hunters, sweeping across the Reich with a reach that extended far beyond the bomber stream. They strafed airfields, destroying aircraft before they left the ground. They blasted locomotives, junctions, and roads, tearing apart the supply networks the Luftwaffe depended upon. Each mission multiplied the pressure on a system already stretched to its limits. For German ground crews, the distant growl of a Mustang's engine became a warning that even the airfields were no longer safe. In command rooms, the psychological shift was subtle but unmistakable. German officers who had once spoken confidently of controlling their own airspace now admitted, quietly at first, that the sky no longer belonged to them. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as a decisive instrument of blitzkrieg, a force that imposed momentum and dictated tempo. Now it fought defensively, reacting rather than acting, unable to mount the comprehensive operations that had once defined its strength. Even as new fighter models rolled out of factories, Bf-109GS, FW-190S, and the first jets, there were too few seasoned pilots to fly them effectively. Quantity without quality became a hollow metric, and each failed interception deepened the sense of inevitability. Reports from the front lines painted an increasingly bleak picture. Units exhausted their veteran corps. Replacement pilots rotated in and fell quickly. A cycle emerged: reduced experience produced higher losses, and higher losses demanded more replacements, each with less experience than the last. It was a downward spiral that fed upon itself, tightening with each passing month. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of German military ambition, now found itself fighting against the arithmetic of attrition, the constraints of fuel, and the relentless precision of an enemy that improved with every mission. By late 1944, the collapse had become unmistakable. German fighters still rose to meet the Allied raids, but they did so in scattered numbers, lacking cohesion, lacking confidence. The once formidable defensive system that had guarded the Reich from the Channel to the Carpathians had thinned into isolated pockets of resistance. The Luftwaffe still flew, but it no longer fought as the force it once was. Its legacy, its tactics, its doctrine, all remained, but the pilots who had given those ideas life were fading from the sky. And as American fighters patrolled deeper with each passing week, one truth settled across Europe: the Luftwaffe had entered a downward spiral from which it would not return. Yet the consequences of that collapse were only beginning to shape the final acts of the war, reaching toward the decisive operations still gathering in the months ahead. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had shifted so profoundly that Allied planners spoke of the coming invasion of France with a confidence unthinkable a year earlier. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now lay open, their former defenders scattered, exhausted, or absent. In planning rooms across England, generals examined maps not with apprehension but with opportunity. The elimination of German air power was not simply an advantage, it was the prerequisite that made Operation Overlord possible. And at the center of this transformation stood the P-51 Mustang, a fighter that had done more than escort bombers. It had reshaped the very environment in which the war was fought. With the Mustangs patrolling above the bomber streams, the accuracy of Allied bombing improved in ways that surprised even seasoned commanders. For the first time, bomber crews could focus fully on altitude, wind, and aim points rather than bracing for the sudden loss of escorts. They flew steady, deliberate approaches to their targets, adjusting formation with a precision impossible during the frantic, unprotected raids of 1943. German interceptors, once the persistent threat that disrupted every attack run, now found themselves suppressed, delayed, or destroyed before they could interfere. The presence of the P-51 did not merely shield the bombers, it gave them the time they needed to strike decisively. The effect on Germany's vital infrastructure was immediate and severe. Oil refineries at Luna and Pollitz, transportation hubs at Hamm and Cologne, and ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, all locations once able to resume production after scattered raids, now faced repeated, sustained blows. Mustang squadrons escorted bombers over each target, then circled outward to attack airfields, locomotives, and repair crews attempting to restore damaged lines. The Reich's industrial system, built on efficiency and constant throughput, faltered under pressure. Pipelines failed, warehouses emptied, and traffic that had once flowed across the country slowed to a crawl. By mid-1944, the consequences reached the front lines. Field commanders reported shortages not in isolated pockets, but across entire divisions. Fuel shipments arrived late or not at all. Armored units rationed ammunition. Spare parts, once taken for granted, became so scarce that vehicles sat immobilized behind the lines while their crews waited for replacements that never came. What had begun as a calculated bombing strategy evolved into a systemic paralysis, an immobilization of the German war machine from the inside out. In this environment, the P-51 emerged not simply as a tactical escort but as a strategic instrument. Its range allowed planners to target facilities deeper within Germany, severing arteries that connected factories to depots and depots to the battlefield. Its speed and altitude capability meant it could respond quickly to threats, intercepting German fighters before they could mass, and striking supply lines before recovery efforts took hold. The Mustang became a force multiplier, one that linked operations across the continent by denying the Luftwaffe any opportunity to reassert control. More subtly, the aircraft influenced the psychology of the war. German ground troops, who had once looked to the sky for support, now watched as American fighters roamed overhead with impunity. Each Mustang passing low over a rail yard or convoy signaled that the Reich no longer controlled its own airspace. The effect was corrosive, wearing down morale in ways no statistic could fully capture. Allied troops, by contrast, advanced toward France with a new sense of assurance. They marched, knowing that the enemy's aircraft, once symbols of German dominance, would rarely appear. As summer approached and preparations for D-Day accelerated, the Mustang's impact became inseparable from the broader Allied strategy. It had altered the timing of the invasion by creating conditions in which no German counterattack could gather strength. It had reshaped the geography of the war by allowing Allied air power to reach into territories previously beyond its touch. And it had changed the psychology of the conflict by turning the Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of German ambition, into a force fighting for survival with every passing week. The long-range fighter had done more than escort bombers. It had opened the door to liberation by clearing the skies, undermining the enemy's industry, and ensuring that when the Allies finally crossed the Channel, they would land on a continent where German air power could no longer dictate the pace of war. And in the weeks ahead, as the invasion neared, the Mustang's role would expand even further, toward a final chapter already gathering on the horizon. Years after the war, veterans would search for the moment when the balance of the air war truly shifted. Some pointed to Big Week, others to the long winter over the Rhine, but many returned to a single memory: Mustangs glinting in the pale sky above Berlin on March 6, 1944. They described that sight not as a tactical surprise, but as a quiet revelation, the instant when the Luftwaffe's confidence cracked and a new reality descended on both sides of the conflict. For American crews who had once flown into Germany knowing they might not return, the presence of those fighters carried a weight beyond protection. It signaled that endurance, not desperation, now defined the bomber war. What shocked German pilots that day was not merely the appearance of Mustangs, but the realization that their assumptions about distance had been wrong. For years, Luftwaffe doctrine had rested on a single truth: no escort fighter could cross the breadth of the Rhine and fight with strength when it arrived. That belief had shaped strategies, timetables, and interception plans. It had provided comfort when the war turned against Germany elsewhere. But as the Mustangs carved through the cold Berlin air, that certainty evaporated. The disbelief that rippled through German command became a symbol of a deeper hubris, an unshakable faith in limitations that were no longer real. In the reflections of engineers, the Mustang's success seemed almost serene in its inevitability. They spoke of the laminar flow wing with a kind of admiration usually reserved for natural forms, simple in appearance, radical in function. They remembered the moment the Merlin engine was paired with the Mustang airframe, how the merge transformed an overlooked design into a weapon of reach and precision. What struck them most, years later, was not the aircraft's speed or firepower but its efficiency. The Mustang carried its power lightly, covering vast distances while consuming less than its contemporaries. It was, in their view, a machine that solved a strategic problem through elegance rather than excess. Within the 8th Air Force, the war's lesson became clear in hindsight. Firepower had never been the deciding factor in the bomber campaign. Range had been the true currency of survival. The P-51 did not change the bomber war by shooting faster or hitting harder. It changed the bomber war by being present, at the border, at the Ruhr, at Leipzig, over Berlin, and during the long return home. It turned missions from ordeals into operations, transforming attrition from a rule into an exception. In its endurance lay the strategic key the Allies had sought since the first daylight raids of 1942. German pilots, reflecting in later years, often spoke with a quiet respect for the aircraft that had undone their world. They described the Mustang not with bitterness, but with recognition. They had fought it at every altitude, watched it dive with a certainty that betrayed no hesitation, and seen it linger where other fighters would have vanished. Many admitted that the P-51 had fought with the same qualities their own aircraft once embodied: clarity of purpose, balance of design, and the ability to shape the sky rather than merely survive it. In their voices, the respect carried a trace of loss, not just of battles, but of the era in which they had mastered the air. History remembers March 6, 1944, not as an isolated victory but as the moment an old belief system collapsed. It was the day when the Reich learned that distance could no longer shield it, when the bomber war ceased to be a gamble, and when the sky over Europe tilted irrevocably toward the Allies. In the curl of contrails above Berlin, an idea had been undone, a belief that fuel, range, and physics formed immutable barriers. They trusted those limits. They built strategies on them. They thought distance would protect them. It only brought the Mustang to their door,